In this video, we're continuing kind of through the first millennium of the Common Era. So again, I've kind of said this a few times, but just a reminder of the overall history here. About 1500 to 600 BCE is when you have the composition of the Vedas, kind of early formative teachings within what we will call Hinduism. Shortly after 600 BCE, after the Vedas are completed, you will have the emergence of the two great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, along with the Puranas that will continue to be composed throughout really the first millennium of the Common Era, and the Dharma Shastras, which were showing up right around the turn of the Common Era into those first few centuries of the first millennium. So we're still kind of working our way through that first millennium of the Common Era, now kind of working our way toward the end of it by looking at some of the philosophical schools that emerge within Hinduism. Obviously, as time continues, you have more and more kind of interesting ideas that need to be debated and reflected upon. And this is where philosophers will kind of take over and start thinking about some of these complex ideas. There are eventually six kind of major philosophical schools within Hinduism. By far the most important, I think, for most scholars is the school of Vedanta philosophy. So we're just going to focus on this. We won't say anything more about the other philosophical schools, but Vedanta philosophy continues to this day to be very important. Most times when you think about engaging with Hinduism in a philosophical manner, you will generally be engaging with the ideas that are central to Vedanta philosophy. Now, Vedanta simply means the end of the Vedas. You can see some of the word Vedas there. So the end of the Vedas. Now, if you go all the way back and think about the Vedas, think about those four sections that show up in each Vedic collection. What is at the end of the Vedas? Well, the Upanishads. And obviously, if we're thinking back to the Vedas, if you're going to get philosophical about anything in the Vedas, it's probably going to be about the Upanishads, because remember, that was all about this transformative wisdom that had to be experienced, not conceptualized, in order to hopefully reach moksha. So Vedanta will be a school of philosophy that's really based on trying to figure out all of those things that are hinted at in the Upanishads about the relationship between Atman and Brahman. Again, we've already seen these two terms. They're typed here for you again. Remember that Atman is the individual soul, and Brahman is supreme being. Not a supreme being or the supreme being, but supreme being. Reality itself. It is indescribable. It is without attributes. It cannot be explained any more than infinity can be contained. And somehow we have to figure out the relationship between my soul, my Atman, and reality, and Brahman, right? So eventually, as more and more thinkers start to get engaged with the Upanishads, a philosophical school emerges. The focus is primarily on the Upanishads, although you will also make use of the Bhagavad Gita. Remember that second path, Jnana Yoga, was all about the way of wisdom or the way of knowledge. And that was largely based on the Upanishads. And it was about that relationship between Atman and Brahman, which is why many believe that the Gita is kind of written like an Upanishad as you read your way through it, especially when focusing on that second path. And there are another group of texts that are sometimes consulted called the Brahma Sutras. There are other teachings that have to do with this philosophical relationship between Atman and Brahman, but the Upanishads are primary here. Okay? And I want to talk just briefly about two different Vedanta philosophers, not to get lost in the weeds of their discussions, because this is one of those things, and really it always is when we're talking about philosophy within religious traditions, where you really need to dig in very deeply to really grasp what is going on. And that's not really our purpose right now. So more so than getting lost in the discussion here, I want to just talk about these two individuals to show the diversity within Hindu philosophical thinking about Vedanta. So the first individual is Shankara. Shankara is living right around the 9th century, right around the year 800. That's kind of when he is flourishing. So you can see we're moving our way toward the end of the first millennium. And Shankara is a Vedanta thinker who's approaching all of these teachings, and he comes up with his theory of how to understand the relationship between Atman and Brahman. And his theory will be known as Advaita Vedanta. Advaita Vedanta. And what this means is a non-dualistic approach to Vedanta. Advaita just means non-dual. So this is a non-dualistic, D-U-A-L, non-dual, meaning not two, only one. So what Shankara is saying is that Atman is not separate from Brahman, right? My soul is not actually separate from reality itself, from being, right? And my soul is not separate from your soul or from the desk or the computer. Ultimately, all is one. Ultimately, Brahman is the only reality. And what I think of as my isolated soul really just is Brahman, because Brahman is all that exists, right? The problem is, of course, is that that's not the way we normally think of things. I think of my soul as being different from your soul, and different from everyone else, and different from objects and plants and trees and non-human animals. I think of myself in isolation as a separate entity. And what Shankara tells us is that that thought is simply Maya, which is generally translated as illusion, right? And what Shankara is saying is that I am living under the illusion that I am isolated and separated from all other entities in reality. Because that is an illusion. Ultimately, there is only one reality, and that is Brahman. And I have to see through this illusion that dominates our existence and the way we perceive it in order to experience that transformative wisdom that the Upanishads speak about in order to eventually reach moksha. And this is probably getting to be a little bit of a dated reference, but if anybody remembers the Matrix movies, right, there's something similar going on here, right? The idea in the Matrix movies is that the way everyone was kind of living, thinking that they were walking around and doing all this kind of stuff, that was all an illusion. It wasn't really real. It was all just part of the Matrix, right? It's been a while since I've seen those movies, but I think that's something of what they were after, right? That there was a truer reality. And the real reality, in terms of what was being experienced by all of those people within the Matrix, is the Matrix was in charge of that. You had to actually separate yourself entirely to find a different kind of real experience. So in some way, Shankara is saying that we are now living like we're in the Matrix. We believe all of this is real, but it's not really real, right? What ultimately for Shankara is real is Brahman, the unity of all reality. He also describes this by talking about dreams, right? When we're dreaming, we believe that what we are dreaming is real. But when we wake up, we realize that it wasn't really real. It wasn't really happening. That we are simply deluded into thinking it was happening because we were in a dreamlike state, right? And he says basically, the way we're all living right now is like we're dreaming. We believe all of this is real, but we need to wake up. And if we can wake up and see through the illusion, the Maya of separation and isolation, then we will experience that transformative, unitive knowledge that will allow us, when we die, to fully escape the illusion, right? We can experience a kind of moksha still while living on earth, but of course we're still living in this realm of illusion. We will fully experience liberation only at death, when we are completely released from this illusion of isolation. And this is where I talked about our Atmans perhaps as single drops of water falling into the ocean of Brahman. And all isolation and separation will be ended at that time. Right? Does that mean I still have any sort of self-consciousness at that time? Am I aware of myself? Well, I don't know. And I'm not sure Shankara gives us a super clear answer because he hadn't yet experienced that full release, right? So I don't know if there's some sort of actual kind of continued self-awareness. It doesn't seem that there really should be, if the whole notion of a self-awareness as separate from other entities is the illusion, right? It's pretty confusing stuff. The philosophy that is present in world religions tends to be very confusing stuff because it's dealing on a philosophical level with these very complex ideas about reality, about being, about ourselves, and about the transcendent, right? Now, another Vedanta thinker shows up whose name is Ramanuja, and he's living several centuries after Shankara. This is taking us now kind of into the second millennium, and he's living around the 11th and 12th centuries of the Common Era. And Ramanuja has a different take on Vedanta. He's using all of the same teachings, but he's thinking about them differently. Ramanuja is sometimes referred to as a theistic Vedanta philosopher. Right? Theism, of course, tends to be about a belief in God, and especially in personal deities, right? That's why we think of atheists as those who deny the existence of God, right? So he is a Vedanta thinker who's really focused on the divine, right? Not Brahman necessarily, but actual deities. He is a member of the Vaishnava community. So remember that Vishnu is one of those three who is elevated to be seen as the supreme personal form of Brahman. And typically what is happening then in Bhakti Yoga is that because it's so difficult to understand the abstraction of Brahman, we can actually relate to Brahman through a personal deity. And this is kind of Ramanuja's perspective here. So for Ramanuja, yes, on the one hand, everything is Brahman. Right? He thinks the Upanishads are clear enough that yes, there is some sort of ultimate unity, but he does not agree with Shankara's idea of Maya. Just because there is an ultimate unity doesn't necessarily mean that everything we're experiencing now is an illusion. For Ramanuja, yes, there is ultimate unity, but there is also multiplicity within the unity. There are distinctions within the unity. So yes, all is Brahman, but I am still real. I am a real qualification of Brahman. I am a real manifestation of Brahman. Right? And so are you, and so are the books, and the bookcases, and the desk, and the computer, and everything else. The distinctions are real. The qualifications are real. They are not illusions. We're not just living in a false reality. It is a true reality, but still we have to understand the ultimate unity of it all. And for Ramanuja, the way to do this is by connecting primarily to our personal God, or goddess for some. So for him, Vishnu is that personal deity, and for him, we should worship Vishnu so that when we die, we will not just drop into an ocean and lose all of our self nature, our self-awareness. No, we will experience that joyful, intuitive, and total relationship with our Lord. Right? Our personal Lord. And it's in that intuitive, joyful relationship, that relationship of closeness, that we will ultimately be experiencing the oneness of all reality. Everything is ultimately one, but that doesn't mean that everything shares pure identity. There are still distinctions within the unity, and that most important distinction is between us and our God. And through that inseparability of the relationship, we are experiencing the oneness even though the distinction remains. Again, this is very confusing stuff, and we would have to really read Shankara and Ramanuja to get at what they're really saying. But for our purposes, I just want to think about the complexity and the diversity of Hindu philosophy, and this is only one of those 6 schools, and the allowance for difference of opinion that was present throughout this very formative period of Vedanta philosophy. And this is stuff that continues to this day with Hindu scholars and philosophers still engaging with the Upanishads and with the Bhagavad Gita, trying to figure out what they're telling us about reality. And these are just 2 important pivotal thinkers around the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries that have been remembered for how they discuss that relationship between Atman and Brahman that is so central to the end of the Vedas.